Welcome everyone to the Picnic Blanket podcast, where we take you on a journey to explore food sustainability in the DKW region in Canada through the lens of people care, earth care, and fair share. My name is Sarah Gallego, and I'm here with Ben Mueller, Emma Bedal, and David Escher to talk about the execution of Granny's secret mission. So at this point in the story, the kids are going to the restaurant where Uncle Jed works in order to help Granny prepare all the food that is needed for the special dish. We see the kids interacting with the food and the kitchen supplies, and they're all integrating all the elements that they have learned throughout their journey. And we also see how Uncle Jed earns himself a promotion by incorporating sustainable food practices in the workplace. So now, the topics that we're going to be covering in the podcast are the following: food literacy, issues around food literacy, the learning process of the characters in the kitchen, and we will touch a little bit upon the generational aspects, which is the one that influences the kids to learn everything that they're learning. So to start things off, I want to talk about how at the beginning of part three, we start seeing the kids right away asking, what can I do? What can I do? They're all like so excited to take part on doing everything that they can to get this dish ready, which for me really represents the beautiful learning process. And so we just see them like all so excited, but at the same time, there's also like that sense of like, what if things go wrong?
Totally, yeah. So they get into the kitchen, and Uncle Jad is describing, this is what you can do, and this is what you cannot do, without help from an adult in the kitchen. And so Georgia's really hesitant because she's like, so what can we do? It seems like there's all these rules, and Granny comes up with this suggestion of just getting involved with the food prep. So not necessarily having them doing the complicated cooking because, it's just a gradual skill building element that's really important to building food literacy with kids, kind of, from grandparents to parents to their kids. And, food literacy is a huge issue. And going back to the paper that we read about this, Sarah, did you want to cover that?
Yes, thank you, Ben. So I just wanted to mention now that you're just talking about like you just gave us like a little bit like of an intro to like the story as well. It's just like if we go back to that part where we're seeing like all the kids asking these questions, and as you just mentioned, Uncle Jad is telling them like what they can do, what they cannot do, and how to be like a little bit careful in the kitchen. But then we also see how at the same time, while they're asking all these questions, they are responding to Uncle Jad with elements that they have learned through their journey. And so this is where it actually highlights the food literacy that we're talking about, and the food literacy that we want to really incorporate, and that we want this to be sort of like our message. And that's basically what we see when Uncle Jad asks Zayed what part of the food that we needed to use, that they had to use. And that is when he says all of it, and he says so proudly that there's no apple left behind.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because kids learn in so many ways, different ways, and we're showing that. And we're showing that when the kids went to the farm, like just from visiting the farm, they were learning it by like reciting "No apple left behind." But I think also just from like the reading, making something out of nothing, it shows that like the one-on-one teaching from a parent or a relative or a friend or anything like that, that really is the best way that kids can really learn in the kitchen. And so having Uncle Jad and Granny like directly teaching the children different skills, that's going to be another great way that they can learn all these different food skills and that they're going to take with them. But I also know like some people aren't as fortunate. I know David, when I brought this up, he was saying, well, his grandma isn't with him. So what do people do when, like, we're right now in our story, we're communicating, these kids are learning from their grandma, their family. What happens if you don't have that grandma figure in your life?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's one of those things you don't realize you've got till it's gone. And my grandmother passing made me realize that I missed a lot of her cooking, her food, her style, and that I took for granted in a lot of those things. And, it was the food. I just want to step back a second because some of our listeners may not be completely on the same page as what is food literacy. So when we say food literacy, we're talking about food skills, knowing how to prepare, preserve, and utilize food to its maximum potential. That way we're also picking food when it's right, having it closer to having our food closer to where we're eating it, that sort of thing, being closer to our sources of food, because then we're having a higher nutritional value. These sorts of skills are things that our grandparents learned just innately by living, because it was such a traditional thing. And I think our society has been, in these food skills, have been eroded by capitalism and instant food being able to be made through a microwave. Things like instant pancakes is kind of where it all started. When we get right back to it, the original first instant food was instant pancakes. And so when we look at these things, we see that we forgot a lot of what we should know. And I think that's where I began to start to really miss my grandmother. And so when I talked to my sister about it, she said, I remember the smell of my hands because Granny would get me to strain out that onion so that all the juice was out, so that it was better for the meatballs, the kofta. And I don't have that memory because I was a little younger than she is, but it's one of those things that she knows that skill and actually helped me in the kitchen the other day making kofta. So I think we take it all for granted a little bit, and I think that's why these characters are so relatable. But I think it's difficult for some of us right now because we don't have that generational gap, and some of us can maybe turn to a neighbor or a friend who may have an older person that might be able to help us. But last week, we were also exposed to somebody like Nicola, who's been able to take some of these things from learning food literacy out in the picking of it and what sort of medicines and things that our grandparents might have recommended, just like, oh, you should have more tea right now or have more garlic when you're about to get sick. These sorts of things, we're missing out on them. And I think that that's what our characters are trying to bring in. And then, yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll let somebody else take over, but yeah.
Thank you so much, David. I really like that you really highlighted sort of like that contrast between, I guess, maybe like our first scenes that like we really wanted to show like that like bad relationship with food, and then we're really focused on the microwave, which is something that you mentioned, and then how we have this contrast now where they're in a kitchen and they're actually using a pot on the stove, right? They're turning on the oven and they're learning how to use like all these utensils and all like these different like things that they haven't used before. But then another very important aspect is that we're also playing around a little bit with the generational aspect, because not only are the kids learning and like basically telling their uncle and their grandmother what they've learned, but then we also see Uncle Jad incorporating elements of what he actually learned and what he knows. And that is exactly what we see in the little section where he gets the promotion. So I know, Ben, you want to talk to us a little bit more about how Uncle Jad gets his promotion?
Yeah, totally. So what happens is Uncle Jad is thinking back to a part earlier in the book when he discovers how one of the farms uses every part of the fruit to make either like another food product, which is kind of like food upcycling in a way, or they are able to use compost. And so Uncle Jad comes back to the kitchen, and we wanted to incorporate this part of the story because there's actually restaurants in the KW region that do use compost in a really effective way, and really closes the loop, so to speak, in terms of their waste cycle. And he just comes up with a very basic idea of what if we just compost? And it's not even like he's doing it in an incredibly difficult way. He just starts with a bucket, and this is highlighted by some of the conversations we had from chefs around the KW area, where they just were curious about what their waste was like from different food sources. And they just started with a very simple audit of just weighing the waste that they had. And so Uncle Jad, we kind of had him exemplify this just by writing compost on a bucket, seeing what they could do with the scraps. And the head chef is asking him, well, what is this, like, what are we going to do with these? And he basically says, well, for the parts that we can recover, we can, maybe incorporate that into things like soups or some other recipes. And, when we're originally sorting it, if there's things that we can't recover, then we can use that to, just if we're going to make compost for a garden that we could potentially start on the property, or maybe contact like an organic waste removal sort of setup. So that is, the story just kind of scratches the surface on that whole aspect of the restaurant food industry side of things. But the waste that you produce is also, knowing what to do with the extra parts of food is also an important part of food skills and food literacy.
So I guess, Ben, you're not explicitly saying, though, that anyone working in the restaurant industry should just go and tell their boss, we're going to start composting and expect to get a promotion, though, right? I think it's a little more than that, and I think that's what you're getting at, is that there's a lot to it. But I think when we're thinking about it in the real sense, there's a lot of application there that is just not, is thinking about the other part of the food cycle. And I think that's what the character Jad really brings out, is that there's another section of this part of the kitchen that we need to think about. And I think that's something we can all do, which is kind of nice, in the sense that, how do we apply this stuff? Because it's difficult and it's easy just to talk about it, but what's something simple we can do? And I think it's more than just taking the food and putting it in a bucket. The food audit takes it to that next level, where then analysis can be done and, really figuring things out. So I really like how that character evolves through this series of use of food literacy in the professional sense, outside of even just your regular kitchen.
Me too, and it's the way he does it too. He just kind of starts doing it. It's the way the restaurants, regardless of and he saw the opportunity and he took it, and it's just that kind of initiative that really gets the ball rolling in a lot of places, for sure.
I was gonna say, yeah, some people might think it's insignificant and like, how much is composting actually gonna help? But I think just showing that, and obviously, yeah, like David said, it's not always gonna lead to a promotion, but just showing that like you can do these little things in your own life, and that while you may think it's insignificant, it's actually having a really large impact, and that one step leads to another step, and every little step is important and it adds up, right? And I think that's really what we're trying to communicate. We're not trying to show you how to get a promotion. We're trying to show you how you can make those little steps in your life. So
yeah, and to that point, but we are saying that these types of actions should be rewarded in some way, and that was just an easy way to incorporate it into the story.
And so that was a perfect way for us to really incorporate this generational aspect into the book. And at the same time, of course, incorporating elements of sustainability. And as David, Emma, and Ben basically just said, is how do you not only create a better relationship with food, but then how do you actually put that in an action? Like, how do you actually do that, not only in your house, but at the workplace? And so I think that it's so nice to not only seeing just the learning process of these kids going through all of these experiences and then bringing everything that they've learned in the kitchen, but then also seeing how this is being rewarded in an adult version of this. So overall, this part of the story really incorporates the food literacy development that we see building up on these kids, the fact that they're able to incorporate so many little parts of what they've learned, things like no apple left behind, and understand why it is so important. So I think understanding that is really what gives it so much value to the story, and where the development of these food skills are to start the journey for these kids. And then we also saw a little bit of food literacy through the generational lens, and we saw how effective food literacy was for Uncle Jad, how he gets his promotion because of the idea of making compost. So this is a main idea that we are really going to begin exploring a little bit more in depth in our next episode. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in part 5.